welcome. As always, like the video and comment down below where you are from and what time it is right now. Today's episode is about two people you might have heard before. Those people are Bonnie and Clyde. But do you know what horrific things they did? You will find that out today. Let's get to it. They weren't born killers. Bonnie Parker once dreamed of becoming an actress, and Clyde Barrow was just a poor Texas boy struggling through the Great Depression. Yet within a few short years, both names would be etched into American history, not for fame, but for a bloody trail of robberies and murders. How did two ordinary young people transform into the most hunted couple in America? And why did the press turn them into icons instead of monsters? This is where their story begins, on the streets of West Dallas, where survival meant breaking the rules. Imagine a young woman writing verses in the margins of a school notebook, not because anyone would publish them, but because she wanted to capture the dreams that seemed far away. And imagine, at the same time, a boy about 50 miles south, bending under the hot Texas sun, picking crops until his hands blistered, thinking of little more than how to earn pennies to help his family get by. These two worlds belong to Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, two teenagers living in Texas during the Great Depression. What they shared most was not opportunity, but poverty, which touched nearly every corner of their lives. While Bonnie turned inward to writing and daydreams, Clyde looked outward at men with fast cars and cash in their pockets, wondering what shortcuts might pull him above the struggle that surrounded him. Bonnie grew up in a poor neighborhood of West Dallas. Her father died when she was just a child, and her mother moved Bonnie and her siblings into the home of her grandparents. It was a crowded house, but family bonds softened some of the difficulty. Still, finances were always a concern, and every meal and every pair of shoes had to be stretched further than most people today might imagine. At school, Bonnie managed to stand out. She was bright, imaginative, and encouraged by teachers who noticed her writing talent. In her essays and small poems, she wrote about yearning, about a sense that she was meant for more than the narrow streets of Dallas. Even then, the idea that her life might be cut short was present in her words, almost like she sensed the trap that poverty had built around her. Clyde, meanwhile, was the fifth of 7 children born to a farming family in Ellis County, south of Dallas. His parents battled to keep everyone fed. The family eventually gave up on farming and moved to industrial West Dallas, where housing was nothing like white picket fences and manicured lawns. Families were packed into makeshift shacks or small houses with no plumbing. Sewage often ran in open ditches. When Clyde was old enough, he worked odd jobs alongside his brothers, sometimes in fields, sometimes trying to pick up temporary labor wherever they could find it. But stable work was scarce, and the constant search bred frustration. To most teenagers these days, dreams might mean college, careers, or new experiences. For Clyde, a dream might simply mean not owing anyone money, not hearing his mother argue about rent, not feeling humiliated by hunger. The economic collapse of the Great Depression made everything worse. Bread lines grew in cities. Evictions were common in neighborhoods like West Dallas. Families packed their belongings in wagons or jalopies and set out in search of something better, but most only traded one hardship for another. Children went to bed hungry, businesses shuttered, and crime began to look less like a choice and more like a way of evening the odds. Clyde was in his teens by then, and he had begun to notice older boys in the area, carrying pistols and driving cars that seemed too nice for their circumstances. They gambled, they talked fast, and they had cash when others had nothing. In an environment where even hard work yielded almost no improvement, this seemed like freedom. Bonnie never quite fit into the picture of a hardened criminal in her youth. She was small, lively, and known for being clever. Friends remembered her as animated, someone who loved writing but also enjoyed dressing up, acting, and social events. Despite these creative outlets, her family's finances always loomed like a ceiling she could not break through. She married young, at 16, to a man named Roy Thornton, but her hopes of stability were dashed when he drifted away, involved in his own small-time crimes. Bonnie never saw him again after he went to prison, though, as law required, she remained legally married. By the time she crossed paths with Clyde, she was barely out of girlhood herself, but already familiar with disappointment and the limits of escape routes for young women with little money. In the wider world, communities like the one Bonnie and Clyde grew up in were often ignored or underestimated. West Dallas earned a reputation as a slum, looked down on by wealthier parts of the city. Newspapers described it as overcrowded and lawless, but reporters rarely explained why. Workers had been displaced, industries could not support the wave of poor families, and landlords collected inflated rents for run-down housing. In that environment, resentment brewed. For many, crime was not just a violation of law, It was a protest against a system that seemed tilted against them. That did not excuse it, but it helps to understand how poverty created conditions where someone like Clyde would begin testing the edges of legality at such a young age. By 17, dealing with such hardship, Clyde had already been arrested for small infractions like stealing chickens and cars. Cars, in particular, held a certain temptation. They were symbols of escape, of speed, of movement away from the confines of broken-down homes and endless labor. To Clyde, every ignition key was a chance to outrun the poor hand life had dealt him, even if it meant another trip in front of a judge. The routine jobs he found never offered enough for him to support himself, let alone a family in the future. Frustration mixed with desperation, and crime began to look less like a stain on character and more like the only gamble left. The facts of Bonnie's life tell a parallel tale of limits. She wrote constantly, weaving stories and lyrics that she sometimes shared with friends. She had the energy of a performer, yet what stage was available to a poor girl from Dallas? There was little outlet for ambition beyond quick marriages, low-paying jobs, or dead-end futures. Some women managed teaching or nursing, but education costs put them out of reach for Bonnie's family. She watched her mother and relatives scraping for stability, and yet she dreamed of attention, of drama, of something memorable. When Bonnie would later pen poems about life on the run, they were not sudden bursts of creativity, but continuations of an artistic voice she had possessed from a young age. Pressed against the rough walls of West Dallas hardship, when people look back today, they often imagine Bonnie and Clyde as chasing excitement. But the truth of their background suggests something much different. We see a story of two kids boxed in by poverty, hunger, and limited escapes. For Clyde, small crimes were first experiments in survival. For Bonnie, imagination met frustration, a life story waiting for someone to share it with. Neither grew up with father figures who could guide them into secure futures. Bonnie's father passed early, and Clyde stretched himself thin just to keep food on the table. These beginnings did not excuse what they would go on to do, but they planted the seeds. Survival was the constant thread. Hard work offered little reward. Hunger pulled families apart. Dreams shrank or twisted into something darker. These circumstances created Bonnie and Clyde long before newspapers or police files gave them those infamous titles. The girl who wrote of longing and the boy who saw no escape from dusty fields were shaped by the same storm. And when the two finally met, it was not just a romantic connection. It was the collision of two young lives already primed to take risks, already carried along by hardship. Their meeting was not simply fate. It was the product of an environment where poverty narrowed choices until crime felt inevitable. That single encounter would seal the path forward, one that neither poems nor stolen cars could ever turn back. What happens when two star-crossed young people meet at the wrong moment in history? In January of 1930, Bonnie Parker was 19 years old, restless, and living with her mother in West Dallas. Clyde Barrow, just a few months shy of 21, had already been in trouble with the law for car theft. The circumstances of their first meeting were plain on the surface. Clyde came to visit a friend, and Bonnie happened to be there. Neither had wealth or status, and both grew up surrounded by hardship. Yet in that moment, something between them sparked, something that made them inseparable within days. At the time, Bonnie still wore the ring from a failed marriage that tied her to a husband she had not seen in years. She was hungry for something more meaningful than the dull routines of low-wage jobs and family obligations. Clyde, meanwhile, walked into her life already carrying the dust of police records on his shoes. He was used to brushes with the law by then, and though he was not known yet as a dangerous figure, he was well on that path. To Bonnie, this did not matter. The life she had before him seemed too narrow, too predictable. Clyde offered movement, rebellion, and a sense of purpose she had not felt before. The timing was both fateful and tragic. Within weeks of meeting Bonnie, Clyde was arrested once more for auto theft. This was hardly unusual for him, but the difference now was that Bonnie was present to see it. She sat by him as he was taken into custody. To most, this should have been enough to drive her away. For Bonnie, it only deepened her attachment. She visited him in jail, wrote him letters, and saw herself as someone meant to stand beside him even through confinement. Through these visits, their bond grew stronger, shaped by loyalty and sacrifice, rather than comfort or stability. What connected them ran deeper than romance. Both had grown up in households where money was always scarce, where they saw neighbors lose homes and fathers bend under the weight of limited work. They were young adults in a country that had no easy future for the working poor. Their conversations crossed over from flirtation to a shared dissatisfaction with the world they lived in. Bonnie did not just see Clyde as a criminal, She saw him as someone railing against the same limitations that had always bound her. For Clyde, Bonnie became more than a girl he admired. She was a partner who seemed willing to follow him, even when the path led to jail cells and courtrooms. The weeks of separation, while Clyde sat behind bars, only hardened Bonnie's commitment. Her friends described her as loyal to a fault. She visited when she could, and she carried his words with her. For someone who had once dreamed of being a writer, here was a story she was living, one with tension and danger and emotion. To her, this love story felt like destiny. She began slipping from being a bystander to an accomplice in the making, embracing the identity of someone who would stay true no matter what. To outsiders, their meeting may not have seemed extraordinary. Young people fell in love all the time in those neighborhoods, often under less than promising conditions. But in this case, the timing made it extraordinary. Clyde was entering one of the most defining phases of his life. Imprisonment at Eastham Prison Farm. Bonnie entered the picture right as his youthful defiance was about to harden into genuine bitterness. Their bond, then, was not forged in the safety of young love, but in the uncertainty of police arrests, barred windows, and broken chances. The irony is that their earliest days together were not marked by crime sprees or highway robberies. They were marked by waiting, by letters, and by longing. Bonnie chose to tie her hopes to a man whose future pointed toward a prison more than a wedding ring. That choice makes sense only when looked at through the context of her own life. Nothing around her suggested a future of growth or opportunity. In Clyde, she saw struggle, but she also saw escape, movement, and a sense of story. It was less about the crimes he had committed then, and more about the fact that he was willing to risk everything to resist the grinding poverty they both knew too well. This is where the line between romance and survival pact first blurred. Did Bonnie love Clyde as a man? Yes, but she also loved what he represented, a defiance of the boxed-in life, waiting for her if she stayed the course. Did Clyde love Bonnie? Undeniably, but he also saw in her an ally, someone whose loyalty would survive even when his world became harsher. Together, they built a connection not only on affection, but also on defiance against their shared conditions. In some ways, their story could have ended right there, with Clyde locked up and Bonnie pulling back to rebuild her life. That would have been ordinary. What made it extraordinary was that Bonnie did not retreat. Instead, she leaned into the chaos that came with loving Clyde, even when that chaos meant late-night escapes, whispered plans, and long stretches of fear. Their meeting, simple and forgettable at face value, became the ignition point of a saga still remembered nearly a century later. Clyde's arrest after they met only set the stage for a darker transformation. Prison would soon strip away his remaining softness and return him to Bonnie as someone radically changed. This, more than their initial courtship, would define what followed: the crimes, the bloodshed, the alliances, and betrayals. Their meeting in January 1930 introduced Bonnie to Clyde as a troubled but charming young man. What she would receive after his time in Eastham was a man hardened by brutality, ready to take up arms not only against society, but against the very prison system that had shaped him. Bonnie and Clyde's story did not begin with gunfire. It began with a meeting that seemed small at the time, two young adults colliding at the wrong moment, in the wrong place, with too many obstacles stacked against them. Yet from that spark came one of the most infamous partnerships in American history, a partnership born out of longing, poverty, and defiance. And as Clyde's prison years unfolded, what started as a romance was about to become something far more dangerous. What kind of experience can turn a petty thief into a ruthless outlaw? For Clyde Barrow, the answer came during his years at Eastham Prison Farm in Texas. He had been arrested for auto theft, a charge that would normally mean serving time but with the possibility of release as a still young man. What he did not know yet was that time inside Eastham would leave scars far deeper than the ones on paper. His sentence may have looked like punishment for minor crime, but the reality of Eastham was something closer to organized suffering. Eastham was known across Texas as one of the harshest prison farms in the state. Inmates worked long hours in fields under the watch of armed guards. The work was brutal, carried out in punishing heat, and prisoners were treated less as men and more as expendable labor. The system prized control above all else. Clyde entered this environment as a teenager who had committed theft, but nothing violent. What he experienced inside would change the way he thought about authority, justice, and even survival. From the first days, Eastham meant labor in cotton fields, digging, hauling, and performing work that battered the body. Guards enforced order with clubs, dogs, and whips, and inmate-on-inmate violence was routine. Clyde was of slight build, not large enough to intimidate others, and in a place like Eastham, that meant he was viewed as vulnerable. Fellow prisoners targeted him for beatings, and within months, stories spread about assaults he endured. This was more than punishment for theft. It was systematic hardening. What might break one man instead grew resentment and anger in Clyde. The prison was less a correctional facility and more a crucible that reshaped him. In order to survive, Clyde developed a sharper instinct. Many accounts describe how he quickly learned when to fight and when to yield, when to avoid attention and when to act. Prison behavior often hinged on control of others, sometimes violently. Clyde was victimized repeatedly during his early months, and eventually he retaliated. Reports suggest that he killed another prisoner who had assaulted him using a pipe. He did not face punishment because another inmate already serving a life sentence took the blame. That incident demonstrates the environment he lived in. Survival demanded violence, and systems inside made accountability almost irrelevant. Work details were relentless. Prisoners would march to fields before dawn and remain until nightfall. The labor broke down inmates' bodies. Clyde came to hate the sheer exhaustion as much as the abuse. He delivered cotton loads and cut timber in conditions made worse by malnutrition and heat. Guards forced prisoners to keep pace, threatening them if they slowed. The work wore Clyde down so much that he resorted to a drastic measure to end his misery. With the help of another inmate, Clyde used an axe to cut off 2 of his toes, one big toe and part of another. He knew that crippling himself would keep him from being assigned to field labor again. The act reveals how desperate Clyde had become. He was willing to maim himself for even a chance at relief from unending toil. His injury left him with a permanent limp, a reminder of Eastham that would follow him the rest of his life. Ironically, he was released soon after, due to a petition from his mother. Had he known that freedom was near, he may never have taken such a drastic step, but in that moment, he no longer cared about risks. He viewed harm to his own body as the only way out. By the time release came, Clyde's view of the world was irrevocably changed. He stepped out of Eastham, not as a young man chastened into a better path, but as someone burning with hatred. The Texas prison system, he felt, had stripped away his dignity and forced him into violent survival. From that experience grew a clear motivation: revenge. He began speaking openly about returning to Eastham, not as a prisoner, but as someone determined to break others out and strike back at the institution that had scarred him. That obsession with payback explains decisions Clyde made later. While some released prisoners simply tried to rebuild their lives, Clyde gathered weapons and plotted. The farm was not just one chapter of his story, it was the core wound, the one he could not let go. Every robbery in his mind pulled him closer to being strong enough to go back and take revenge on the place he despised. Bonnie's loyalty after his release matched his determination with unwavering support, but it meant she was tying herself to a man already focused not on reform, but on violent reprisal. Eastham was designed to deter men from crime, but for Clyde, it did the opposite. It did not rehabilitate him, it trained him. He learned about authority, weakness, and brutality in those fields. He lived through constant violations of dignity. He lost part of his own foot, and in exchange, he walked out carrying an anger so deep that it shaped every action of the years that followed. He was released early, thanks to his family's efforts, but the time he spent there defined the kind of outlaw he would soon become. From the quiet boy who once stole cars for money, prison had manufactured a harder figure. He left with scars across his body, a limp in his stride, and violence in his memory. Eastham had not tamed Clyde Barrow. It had built the man who would later wage war on police departments across Texas and beyond. As much as newspapers later portrayed his story as reckless youth chasing excitement, the truth is that Clyde's anger always pointed back to Eastham. Every theft, every shootout, every crime carried the shadow of those fields. What happened inside the walls of Eastham shaped more than Clyde's body. It filled him with a hatred toward the state system and planted the idea of retaliation as justice. He had not been broken into compliance, he had been trained to fight harder. By the time he returned to West Dallas, he was a different person. The easygoing young man Bonnie had first fallen for was gone, replaced by someone who had seen enough cruelty to believe that cruelty was the only law worth following. Bonnie's next chapter with him began at that point. She had never seen what Eastham had done to him, but she would quickly feel its effects, as Clyde set his eyes on crime and revenge rather than any form of peace. Their reunion was not just about romance anymore. It was the joining of Bonnie's devotion to a man who had been changed forever. That transformation would now anchor their future, one where love and violence walked side by side. Could a young woman's poems and photographs help build one of America's biggest outlaw myths? Bonnie Parker was not only remembered for the crimes she committed, but also for the words she wrote. and the images that surrounded her life on the run. Long before her name appeared in headlines next to bank robberies, Bonnie had been drawn to writing and performing. As a teenager in Dallas, she was known for composing short verses, acting in school plays, and posing for pictures with her friends. That creative instinct never left her, even when her circumstances became tied to Clyde Barrow and a life on the road. In many ways, her pen and the lens of a camera would shape how the world saw them just as much as the guns they carried. While Clyde emerged hardened by prison and focused on revenge, Bonnie's presence gave their story another dimension. She often wrote poems that carried themes of fate and doom, reflections of life as a fugitive. Her words showed both awareness of danger and a sense of pride in defiance. Though she never published them in her lifetime, her verses were eventually printed and became part of the cultural memory surrounding the couple. In them, she presented herself and Clyde not only as criminals but as tragic figures caught in a struggle with society. The poems made people see her not simply as a gangster's companion, but as a voice describing their journey in real time. It was not only writing that shaped her image. Photography played an equally powerful role. In 1933, after the police raided one of their safe houses in Joplin, Missouri, they recovered a set of undeveloped photographs. Among the pictures were staged images of Bonnie and Clyde, posing with weapons, standing in front of stolen cars, smiling and looking confident. These photographs were quickly printed by newspapers across the nation. For many Americans, it was the first time they saw the faces behind the names. These were not mugshot images but snapshots that seemed almost playful, taken during quiet moments between crimes. The timing of their release transformed them in the public imagination. One photograph in particular became notorious. It showed Bonnie, small in stature, grinning with a cigar clamped between her teeth, a pistol in her hand, and her pose suggesting mock aggression. At the time, women smoking cigars was seen as improper. Women handling guns in a defiant manner was even more shocking. Though the picture appeared staged as a joke, its effect was serious. The press seized on it, calling her cigar-smoking gun moll and linking her image to an idea of daring lawlessness. The attention surprised even law enforcement, who had not expected pictures to take on such weight in the story. The contrast between photos of Bonnie and the reality of her injuries also highlights the difference between myth and truth. In many accounts, Bonnie was already suffering from a serious leg injury at the time those photographs became public. A car accident during a getaway had left her with severe burns and long-term damage. She often needed help walking, and getting in and out of cars was difficult. Yet, in the nation's newspapers, the image most people saw was the young woman standing proudly with a cigar and gun, not the injured fugitive, struggling to keep pace. The photographs created a false sense of strength and glamour, one that disguised the exhaustion and pain of life on the run. In her verses, Bonnie's outlook was just as complex. She wrote about dying young, about authorities pursuing them to the death, and about standing together with Clyde, no matter the cost. She framed their crimes within a larger story of love and fate. This voice added fuel to the press coverage, which often leaned toward sensationalism. Instead of focusing only on victims or stolen money, newspapers also repeated her words and pointed to her rhymes as evidence of her character. These writings blurred lines between confession, publicity, and personal expression. The wider public, living in the harsh years of the Depression, latched onto this image. To some struggling families, Bonnie and Clyde did not appear only as killers. They were printed in papers as rebellious, young, and fearless, living a life unthinkable to those trapped in poverty and routine. Bonnie's poems and the staged photos gave people something tangible to attach to the couple's legend. The fact that she was a woman played a key role too. Audiences who might ignore another nameless male outlaw paid closer attention to a female figure who seemed to defy every expectation of what women should or should not do. Still, the truth remained different. The Barrow gang's robberies left officers dead and families grieving. Guns they carried were not simply props, they were used with deadly effect. The gap between the reality of bloodshed and the images of playful posing is startling. Yet this gap is exactly what gave the couple lasting myth. Media leaned into symbolism rather than reality. Bonnie became a face for the story, even though Clyde held the weapons and rage toward Eastham. Without the photos and poems, Bonnie might have been remembered as a tragic companion. Because of them, she became the very heart of their story's mythology. Her role in the image-making also tells us much about the era. Newspapers depended on dramatic stories to sell copies, especially during a time when people needed distraction from bleak headlines about unemployment and poverty. Bonnie's appearance with Clyde offered the perfect drama: young love, rebellion, daring escapes, and the suggestion of glamour. Whether accurate or not, it was compelling. And as the images circulated, Bonnie herself shifted in the public eye, from bystander to co-leader. She was no longer described as simply following Clyde. She was presented as his equal, cigarette or cigar in hand, rifle within reach. Her poems deepened that image further. One famous verse suggested that she and Clyde knew their end would come at the hands of police. It carried both resignation and pride, a story written with the knowledge of doom. The verses placed their lives within a tragic frame, almost like characters out of a play, rather than fugitives running from real crimes. This pattern of storytelling would repeat in later books, films, and songs, but it began with Bonnie herself, writing in notebooks and offering the first pieces of her own legend. By the time law enforcement realized the power of the photographs and writings, the narrative was already out of their control. The images and words were more memorable than detailed police bulletins, more lasting than dry lists of charges. People held on to the idea of Bonnie, not Bonnie Parker as she lived day by day, limping from injuries and fearing ambush, but Bonnie as she appeared in captured moments, smiling with Clyde, clutching a pistol, standing against society. Her role in shaping that myth cannot be overstated. Without Bonnie's poems and the photographs abandoned in Joplin, the story of Clyde Barrow might have been like that of any other Depression-era outlaw, briefly notorious and then forgotten. Instead, Bonnie made their partnership unforgettable. She transformed from an accomplice into the enduring image of the tale. In doing so, she guaranteed that the name Bonnie and Clyde would live beyond their lifetimes, as both crime partners and cultural symbols. This transformation of image set the stage for the next shift. With Bonnie recognized publicly and Clyde carrying determination formed in prison, their small partnership began to attract more figures. The Barrow gang was about to emerge, expanding the scope of their crimes and amplifying the very myth Bonnie helped create. How did a small romance expand into one of America's most feared gangs? When Clyde Barrow walked out of Eastham Prison in 1932, he did not step into a life of reform. He left determined and angry, with his focus squarely set on preparing for something bigger. His partnership with Ralph Fultz, another young man already in trouble with the law, set the tone for this new phase. The two began robbing small stores and gas stations almost immediately. These were not random robberies. They were careful attempts to collect cash and, more importantly, weapons. The short-term goal was money. The long-term plan was to arm themselves well enough to attack Eastham itself, the prison that had left Clyde with scars both inside and out. From the beginning, there was a single thread tying their crimes together: revenge. Bonnie Parker soon joined Clyde again, despite knowing what a life with him would mean. Her loyalty was never in doubt. She brought not only companionship, but a sense of identity to their small partnership. Her presence solidified Clyde's resolve to dream bigger. He was no longer content stealing cars or holding up simple storefronts. With Bonnie by his side, every robbery felt like a step toward a larger mission. In the early months, there was little glamour. They targeted vulnerable businesses, gas stations, groceries, and small shops, making off with only modest amounts. But they were building resources. For Clyde, it was a preparation period. For Bonnie, it was the realization that she had tied herself to a crusade against the system. The dynamic grew as new members filtered in. One of the first to become fully involved was a teenage neighbor from West Dallas named W.D. Jones. Barely 16, Jones idolized Clyde and saw crime as an adventure. His youth gave the gang an air of recklessness, but Clyde saw his eagerness as useful. Not long after, Clyde's older brother Buck Barrow entered the picture. Buck had been in and out of trouble himself, but his joining marked a shift for the group. With Buck came his wife, Blanche. She was uneasy about crime from the start, but followed her husband out of duty, hoping she might convince him to settle down. Instead, she found herself pulled into a moving caravan of fugitives. By the time the Barrow gang came together under that name, it was no longer just a couple of small-time thieves. Each member played a part. Bonnie contributed loyalty and myth-making. Clyde drove the strategy, shaped by his experiences in prison. Buck brought family reinforcement. Blanche added complication, as her discomfort clashed with the outlaw life. And Jones offered the unsteady energy of youth. Together, they created something unusual, a group blending family, loyalty, and crime into a single, moving unit. This expansion also meant a change in tactics. Rather than short, scattered robberies, the gang began planning larger ones. Targets included not only shops, but also banks. Jailbreaks were openly discussed, particularly the dream of breaking prisoners out of Eastham. The group's ambitions shifted away from simply making ends meet toward confronting authority. For Bonnie and Clyde, Crime became more than survival. It began to feel like a statement, one meant to show their defiance against the system they believed had wronged them. One defining element of Clyde's vision for the gang was firepower. He was never satisfied with small pistols or occasional shotguns. He wanted military-grade weapons, especially the Browning automatic rifle, known as the BAR. This weapon was far more powerful than what most police departments carried at the time. It could fire rapidly, cover wide ranges, and cut through barriers that smaller guns could not. Clyde made it a priority to steal BARs and keep them in the gang's growing arsenal. Soon, the Barrow gang was outgunning local law enforcement at almost every confrontation. Car chases and ambushes that might have ended quickly instead escalated into long firefights, with police often forced to retreat under superior fire. Armed with stolen BARs and an array of rifles and pistols, the gang drove across Texas and into nearby states, robbing and escaping time after time. Each successful getaway emboldened them. They no longer resembled corner store thieves. They were battle-ready fugitives, traveling in stolen cars that doubled as weapons when bullets were not enough. To many small-town police officers, facing them felt like facing an army. The law enforcement of the early 1930s was not equipped for battles with heavy firepower. Radios were limited, coordination between counties was weak, and officers carried service revolvers that seemed almost useless against Clyde's beloved automatic rifles. Bonnie's presence in the car during these armed battles added to the gang's mystique. A woman riding with heavily armed men stood out in that era. Press coverage magnified it, picturing her not as the injured young woman she was, often needing help to walk, but as a daring outlaw mocking the system. Newspapers described her in ways that made her larger than life. This gave the gang attention, but it also increased the pressure closing in around them. People recognized their faces now. Posters went up in towns where they had never even stopped. Their weapons may have kept them alive in gunfights, but their growing fame made them constant targets. Inside the gang, there was tension. Blanche wanted a different life, but the wave of crime pulled her further away from peace. Buck often tried to balance his wife's desires with his loyalty to Clyde and Bonnie. Jones, so young, sometimes felt overwhelmed by the violence. Yet he stayed. Each new robbery and each new state line crossed bound them together. They were already in too deep to walk away, and Clyde, carrying hatred from Eastham like a torch, would not allow retreat. Every move led toward his vision of revenge, breaking prisoners free and striking against the guards and system that had nearly broken him. As crimes escalated, so did the danger. Police learned quickly that this was no group of petty thieves. They began watching highways more closely, arming themselves better, and calling in reinforcements across county and even state lines. Yet for every narrow escape, the Barrow gang's legend grew. They were becoming something far larger than their crimes alone. Each robbery was a headline. Each shootout was a story that spread across states. And each escape added to the sense that they were untouchable, even when that belief was far from true. By 1933, the Barrow gang had become one of the most feared collections of fugitives in the nation. Their growth from a romance between Bonnie and Clyde into a group carrying Browning rifles and cutting down officers in gunfights was rapid and devastating. They were no longer simply stealing gas or a small purse of money. They were openly waging war on law enforcement, crossing borders, and capturing national attention. This transformation cemented them not just as criminals, but as a symbol of armed defiance, feared wherever they were rumored to be. The outcome of this rise was inevitable. With each robbery and every exchange of gunfire, authorities grew more determined. The net around them tightened as they fled from state to state. Yet the Barrow gang was not yet finished. Their notoriety, fueled by Bonnie's image and Clyde's weapons, was about to explode onto the front page of every newspaper after a single violent confrontation in Missouri. How could one gunfight transform fugitives into celebrities? On April 13, 1933, the Barrow gang's rented apartment in Joplin, Missouri, became the center of a violent shootout that changed everything. They had been hiding out at 3,347 1-2 Oak Ridge Drive, a cramped garage apartment, using it as a temporary base while they planned their next move. To the police, the address was just another suspected bootlegging location, a place where men were thought to be running alcohol during Prohibition. Officers expected to confront a few smugglers. Instead, they walked straight into one of the most dangerous gangs in the country. The stakes would become clear within minutes, but by then, the damage was already irreversible. Inside the unit that day were Clyde Barrow, Bonnie Parker, Buck Barrow, Blanche Barrow, and W.D. Jones. They had been living quietly, keeping the car parked inside the garage, but neighbors noticed strange behavior. Shots were fired at tin cans outside, late at night. Loud music echoed from the apartment, and traffic in and out seemed unusual. Suspicious calls reached police. 5 officers assembled a small team to investigate. They had no idea they were about to walk into the center of armed fugitives, carrying rifles more powerful than anything standard patrolmen had. The police arrived in the late afternoon. Approaching cautiously, they intended a simple raid for illegal liquor. As they reached the garage, Clyde and his group sprang into action. Gunfire lit the air almost immediately. Clyde, armed and prepared, shot at the officers through windows and doors. Weapons trained on the cars outside signaled their intent to fight their way out rather than surrender. At one point, reports say Bonnie herself fired a rifle toward the officers as Clyde started the engine of their getaway car. What began as routine enforcement turned into a battlefield. Within minutes, law enforcement paid a heavy cost. Detective Harry McGinnis was struck by gunfire and died at the scene. Constable J.W. Harriman was also shot and killed during the exchange. Other officers were wounded and forced to retreat. The firepower of the Browning automatic rifle, stolen earlier by the Barrow gang, completely outmatched the sidearms carried by police. Clyde poured bullets into the street with precision. Officers, pinned down and overwhelmed, could not hold their ground. The gang had turned an arrest attempt into a devastating defeat for local law enforcement. The escape carried a heavy price for the Barrow gang as well, though not in deaths. In their frantic rush to flee, they abandoned a trunk full of personal belongings. Buck's parole papers, handwritten poems by Bonnie, Clyde's weapons, and other personal items filled the rooms. Even more significant was a camera left behind in the chaos. Inside it, undeveloped film waited, unnoticed until police collected the debris. These rolls of film would do more to shape their reputation than any crime they had yet committed. The photos, once developed, were startling. Instead of mugshots taken under arrest, these were pictures the gang had staged for themselves. Bonnie smiled with a revolver in hand, striking playful poses. In one, she clenched a cigar between her teeth and pointed a pistol at the camera, her grin playful, almost mocking. Clyde leaned on cars, posed with his weapons, and acted out caricatures of outlaw swagger. W.D. Jones appeared in shots, looking much younger than his years suggested. To police, the pictures provided clear evidence of their identities. To newspapers, they were irresistible. Within days, those photos appeared in papers across the country. Audiences saw something that felt new, a young woman posing tough, standing side by side with armed men. The Depression years were filled with grim headlines of hunger, banks collapsing, workers striking, and families suffering. Against that backdrop, pictures of Bonnie Parker with a cigar and pistol felt unusual, theatrical even. Readers did not see the reality of exhaustion, pain from Bonnie's injuries, or the desperation inside the cramped Joplin apartment. They saw dangerous youth mocking authority and living outside the system. The press quickly elevated the Barrow gang into national headlines. Writers seized on Bonnie's poses, giving her names like cigar-smoking gun moll, and spinning narratives about her as a daring bandit queen. For the first time, Bonnie and Clyde had recognizable faces everywhere. What the public consumed was not the bloody death of 2 officers, or the trail of grief left behind in Joplin, but smiling portraits of outlaws who seemed fearless. This transformation from criminals to cultural figures happened in a matter of days, driven by the photographs left by accident. Law enforcement, meanwhile, saw their work complicated. The papers gave Bonnie and Clyde celebrity status, unintentionally generating sympathy from certain communities. Some readers, tired of banks and business failings, framed the pair as rebellious underdogs. Others viewed them as deadly killers, who needed immediate stopping. The reality was a mix of both, but the focus on image clouded public opinion. The police now chased not just wanted fugitives, but figures who had become part of Depression-era conversation across towns and cities. Among the belongings left behind was also evidence of Bonnie's writing. Poems from her notebooks were recovered and later reprinted, adding to the impression that the couple were more than violent criminals. Her words reflected fatalism, rebellion, and devotion, echoing themes that matched the defiant poses in photographs. Together, words and images built an identity larger than ordinary crime allowed. Bonnie and Clyde stood out, set apart from the dozens of gangs roaming across the region during those years. The consequences of Joplin stretched beyond fame. The shootout cemented in law enforcement the understanding that this was no small-time gang. The guns and tactics proved the Barrow group was more heavily armed than most officers in the Midwest. The killings of McGinnis and Harriman added urgency, forcing lawmen across multiple states to cooperate more closely. While national audiences saw flashy pictures, the response inside agencies was strategic. better coordination, improved weapons, and broader jurisdiction needed to stop them, the fight against the Barrow gang took on new weight from that day forward. Media comparisons of their notoriety created further intrigue. Author Jeff Gwynne later noted that the photos introduced new criminal superstars with the most titillating trademark of all, illicit sex. Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker were wild and young, and undoubtedly slept together. In the conservative language of early 1930s reporting, this suggestion marked them not only as criminals, but also as figures violating social codes beyond the law itself. Sex, rebellion, guns, and glamour now filled headlines where poverty and theft had once been the only story. As photographs circulated, the federal government prepared to take a closer role. A Ford automobile, stolen by Clyde from Oklahoma, and later abandoned in Michigan, provided legal grounds for federal jurisdiction. Crossing state lines with stolen vehicles triggered interstate car theft charges. That meant the FBI could officially participate in the case for the first time. Armed with the photographs and details gathered in Joplin, the Bureau began distributing wanted posters. These included fingerprints, descriptions, and images taken directly from the recovered rolls of film. What began as a routine raid in Missouri had now pulled Bonnie and Clyde into the highest levels of criminal pursuit. For Bonnie and Clyde, Joplin became a symbol of both victory and burden. They had survived a shootout, escaped alive, and evaded capture once more, but the cost was 2 officers dead and their hidden identities scattered across newspapers everywhere. What they left behind shaped how the country saw them forever. They were not faceless fugitives anymore. They were Bonnie and Clyde, the young outlaws posing before cameras, firing guns in the street, and mocking authority with grins. The shootout in Joplin was more than gunfire. It was the collision of crime and image, fact and myth. For the public, it cemented their names. For law enforcement, it deepened determination to end their run. And for Bonnie and Clyde themselves, it marked the point where escape would never again mean anonymity. The photos had locked their identities in print forever. Their road would continue, but now every step was taken under the shadow of their rising fame, and that spotlight would lead them directly toward one of their bloodiest fights at Dexfield Park. What happens when the hunted become trapped in the open? On July 24th, 1933, the Barrow gang found themselves exposed at Dexfield Park, an abandoned amusement area on the outskirts of Dexter, Iowa. For several weeks, they had been moving through small towns and dirt roads, avoiding police as best they could. But the walls were closing in. After a police tip alerted local officers to suspicious activity near the park, law enforcement moved in. This was not a controlled raid or a planned ambush. But once the gang realized authorities had surrounded them, the day turned into a firefight that none of them would forget. At the time, the Barrow gang was in poor shape. Bonnie Parker was still recovering from a brutal car accident near Wellington, Texas, that left her right leg burned so badly that the flesh contracted and pulled tight. Doctors would have called it a third-degree burn that destroyed muscle tissue. For Bonnie, everyday movement had become almost impossible. She often relied on Clyde to carry her, or she hopped on one good leg. Driving long distances became physically punishing for her, and that strain shadowed everything they attempted. The gang was already weakened, worn down after months on the run. The Dexfield Park hideout might have looked sufficient at first glance. It was isolated, set among trees and fields, removed enough from main roads to buy them privacy. But the car they used, and the heavy traffic in and out, made neighbors suspicious. When law enforcement closed in and began firing, Clyde tried to organize the group, but panic took hold. Bullets tore into the camp as Bonnie struggled to move quickly. W.D. Jones, barely 17, ran back and forth trying to help load weapons into cars. Buck Barrow took up arms alongside his brother, but by then, Clyde's leadership was already strained under the pressure. The gunfight became disastrous within minutes. Buck Barrow was struck in the head by gunfire. The injury was devastating, exposing part of his brain. Against expectations, Buck did not die immediately. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking or even eating small amounts of food. But the sight alone damaged morale. As shots rained around the park, the others realized there was little hope of him recovering. W.D. Jones later tried to dig a grave for Buck, a grim acknowledgement of the hopelessness inside the gang. Even though Buck still lived, his wound told them he was already lost. Blanche Barrow, Buck's wife, was caught in the middle of the chaos. She supported her husband, trying to shield him, but her own injuries soon marked her. Flying glass cut into her eyes as law enforcement pounded the park with gunfire. The pain blurred her vision, and she was nearly blinded. As the shootout dragged on, Blanche's ability to keep moving weakened. By the end of the confrontation, Surrounded and unable to escape properly, she was captured by police. The combination of Buck's mortal wound and Blanche's capture struck the gang at its core, breaking its tight family structure. For Bonnie, the Dexfield trap was harder still. Her leg injury from weeks earlier left her nearly immobile. While her photographs circulated in newspapers showing her as playful and daring, the reality in Iowa was harsh. She had to be carried or dragged during the firefight. Clyde, devoted to her survival, refused to leave her behind, even as police fire grew heavier. The difference between her public image and her condition at Dexfield shows how far removed myth was from reality. Instead of running with rifles in hand, she was clinging to Clyde, relying on him to carry her through chaos. Despite overwhelming odds, Clyde managed to guide Bonnie and Jones out under fire. Using tree lines and cover, they slipped away from law enforcement, leaving Buck and Blanche trapped. Their getaway was not clean. Clyde drove recklessly as they searched for safety, pushing the car off-road when needed. The small group that remained was battered, bleeding, and exhausted. Buck was left behind in the hands of police. Blanche was taken into custody, and the gang's numbers shrank overnight. Buck's death came days later in a hospital in Perry, Iowa. He endured surgery, but eventually died from his head wound and developing pneumonia. For Clyde, this loss was both personal and strategic. Buck had been his brother, the closest person he had in the gang, outside of Bonnie. With Buck gone and Blanche in custody, Clyde's circle grew smaller. Leadership failures had been exposed. The Dexfield shootout was not a victory or even a stalemate. It was the clearest sign yet that their group was breaking apart under the continuous effort to survive. The violence at Dexfield marked a permanent change in their story. Until then, some observers framed them as daring or clever, even rebellious against authority. After Iowa, there was no bravado left. They were wounded, both literally and emotionally, weakened beyond repair. Bonnie's injury left her permanently disabled. Buck's death left Clyde bitter and unstable. Blanche's capture created holes in confidence and secrecy, since law enforcement now had direct access to a family member who had lived inside the gang's inner circle. From that point forward, the Barrow gang operated more like stragglers than celebrities. Their routes shifted. They moved away from familiar areas of Texas and Oklahoma, roaming into Colorado, Minnesota, and eventually stretching south into Mississippi. These travels reflected desperation. They could no longer count on safe houses or family connections near Dallas. Their movements became an effort to stay ahead, but distance offered little protection when the gang structure had collapsed. Dexfield also proved that law enforcement pressure was intensifying. The raid in Iowa had not been carefully planned in advance, but it revealed how police across rural communities were recognizing and reacting to the gang's presence. Officers were willing to bring heavy firepower, surround wide-open areas, and take decisive action to end the threat. Bonnie and Clyde could still run, but running became harder in both body and spirit. The weakness inside their small group shadowed every journey from then on. The glamour that had followed them after Joplin faded quickly. The press still printed stories, but the tone shifted. Instead of mocking photographs and romantic poems, reports now focused on injuries, near captures, and the mounting death toll. Their national image of rebels on the road gave way to headlines about wounded fugitives clinging to survival. Long gone was the illusion of strength and control. What remained were two young outlaws, staggering under the weight of violence and loss. Dexfield Park was the breaking point. It was the moment when their myth of invincibility cracked wide open. Bonnie carried burns that never healed. Clyde carried grief for his brother, and anger at the state that he believed had doomed them both. Jones carried the weariness of a teenager who had seen far too much. The Barrow gang was no longer an emerging legend. It was a collapsing group barely holding on. The aftershocks would follow them everywhere. Their next violent act, near Grapevine, Texas, stripped away any remaining sympathy, locking their names into a narrative of brutality that overwhelmed all earlier fascination. At Dexfield Park, the hunted had been trapped in the open. From that point on, they would never again be seen as glamorous rebels, only as fugitives nearing their inevitable end. Could one gruesome act erase years of fascination and sympathy? On Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1934, two young highway patrolmen were gunned down on a quiet stretch of road near Grapevine, Texas. Their names were H. D. Murphy and Edward Bryan Wheeler, officers in their 20s, beginning their careers in law enforcement. What happened that day shocked Texas, then spread quickly across the country. Until Grapevine, some saw Bonnie and Clyde as reckless outlaws who thumbed their noses at authority. After, they were viewed very differently, no longer as rebellious figures, but as killers. This moment destroyed whatever romantic image had built around their story. Murphy and Wheeler had been patrolling near the intersection of Route 114 and Dove Road. At the time, Grapevine was a small rural area. The day was calm, traffic was light, and both officers had little reason to expect trouble. When they saw a car pulled off to the side of the road, they slowed to investigate. Inside the vehicle sat members of the Barrow gang, Clyde, Bonnie, and Henry Methvin, who had become one of their associates in the final months of their run. Accounts differ about who fired first, but shots rang out before the officers could react. In an instant, Murphy and Wheeler were both struck and killed. The killings were especially brutal, and newspapers wasted no time in amplifying every detail. Early reports pushed the story that Bonnie Parker herself had taken part in the shooting, even branding her as the one who delivered the fatal shots. According to local papers, witnesses claimed they had seen her laughing as Murphy fell, with one description saying his head bounced like a rubber ball after he was shot. Whether true or not, these exaggerated accounts fueled outrage. The idea of a young woman, already glamorized in photos from the Joplin raid, mercilessly executing a police officer, shattered the last traces of public sympathy. The Dallas papers ran the story in large print. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram reported that officers found a cigar butt with tiny teeth marks, said to belong to Bonnie, which reinforced the tale that she had fired, and then laughed. Even if the details were impossible to prove, the damage was done. The narrative stuck because it was dramatic, horrifying, and contrasted so sharply with the playful photographs of Bonnie that the public already knew. By the time the papers finished, Bonnie and Clyde were no longer mischievous rogues with stolen cars and stage poses. They were ruthless killers, and the public wanted them stopped. The deaths of Murphy and Wheeler also carried symbolic weight. They were young, clean-cut officers, chosen by their departments to represent the future of the highway patrol. They had families and promising lives ahead of them. Their murders became more than crime headlines. They became a rallying point for a public weary of violence. The grief of the families, the shock of communities, and the stark contrast between the two young men in uniform and the outlaw couple filled the conversation across Texas. People who once whispered admiration about Bonnie and Clyde's ability to outwit police now spoke of them as monsters to be eliminated. Only 5 days later, another killing drove the point even further. In Commerce, Oklahoma, law enforcement again crossed paths with the gang. Constable William Cal Campbell was shot and killed during an exchange. Commerce Police Chief Percy Boyd was also kidnapped for a time before being released. That second killing, so soon after Grapevine, confirmed the impression already forming. Bonnie, Clyde, and whoever rode with them had become unpredictable and deadly. For the public, there were no more excuses. For law enforcement, there was no more doubt. The Barrow gang was not simply stealing to survive. They were leaving a trail of bodies. The reaction from officials was swift and direct. L.G. Fares, head of the Texas Highway Patrol, announced a reward of $1,000 for what he called the dead bodies of the Grapevine slayers. That blunt language revealed the intention. Authorities were no longer satisfied with capture. The order was now extermination. Texas Governor Ma Ferguson added another $500 reward for each of the killers, including Bonnie, meaning that there was now a price on her head, separate from Clyde's. These rewards incentivized lawmen and even bounty hunters across the region. Anyone who encountered Bonnie and Clyde now had both moral and monetary reason to end them. The Grapevine killings also reshaped law enforcement tactics. Until then, pursuit was often scattered across jurisdictions. Sheriffs in one county might not communicate quickly with another. Local officers sometimes lacked the weapons to face Clyde's automatic rifles. But after April 1934, there was a coordinated push to unify efforts. Rangers, highway patrolmen, and local sheriffs combined resources. The federal government, through the FBI, had already started paying closer attention after Clyde's stolen cars crossed state lines. Now, the combined pressure meant that Bonnie and Clyde had little safe ground left. Coordination improved, weapons became heavier, and patience for hesitation ended. The shift in public perception was as dramatic as the law enforcement response. Just a year earlier, photographs of Bonnie smiling with a pistol had offered a strange sense of daredevil charm. Ballads were sung about them, some papers played up their escapes, almost like serialized stories. After Grapevine, that tone disappeared. Newspapers no longer called Bonnie a gun mole playfully. They described her as a killer. Readers didn't see outlaws dancing on the margins anymore, they saw cold blood spilled on Easter Sunday. The killings erased the line between fantasy and reality. Victims' faces were in every edition. Families' mourning filled front pages, and outrage grew thicker by the day. Victims' families also spoke out, demanding justice. They had no patience for myths. Murphy and Wheeler's relatives faced funerals instead of stories. Governors and law enforcement leaders recognized the moment and capitalized on public fury to justify aggressive measures. Where leniency or hesitation might have existed before, Grapevine destroyed it. Even ordinary people who had once offered Bonnie and Clyde sympathy, sharing meals quietly when the couple passed through towns, now recoiled. Anyone thought to be aiding them risked being seen as helping murderers. The public's clamor was not just to catch them, it was to wipe them out. The killings at Grapevine and the murder of Cal Campbell in Immerse formed the final pivot point. The outlaw narrative, built through staged photos and Bonnie's poems, could not survive the brutal deaths of young lawmen. Media that had once boosted their legend now became their greatest enemy. The more they ran, the more their criminal acts filled columns, but now every word was hostile. They were killers, not rebels, not romantic partners fighting the depression. And once the press painted them that way, their fate was sealed. By spring of 1934, Bonnie and Clyde were running out of time. Law enforcement had money on their heads, the public wanted blood, and the coordinated network of officers finally had both the resources and the will to bring them down. Grapevine had ripped away their disguise of glamour and made them targets in the clearest possible way. It was not just about ending crime anymore, it was about avenging the dead officers whose faces filled newspapers across the country. The road ahead led south into Bienville Parish, Louisiana. There, a team of officers assembled with a single goal: to wait along a quiet road and make sure Bonnie and Clyde never left alive. Grapevine had turned a manhunt into a death sentence, and the conclusion was only weeks away. How does America's most feared couple meet their end? The beginning of the answer lies with Frank Hamer, a former Texas Ranger with decades of experience. In early 1934, Hamer was asked to track Bonnie and Clyde. This was not a task for standard patrol officers anymore. The Barrow gang had killed lawmen, escaped ambushes, and outgunned police for months. Stopping them required a team with the training and patience to wait for a perfect opportunity. By May of that year, Hamer had assembled a 6-man posse that included Ted Hinton, Bob Alcorn, and B.M. Maney, Galt, from Texas, along with Louisiana officers Henderson, Jordan, and Prentice Morrell Oakley. These were men with backgrounds in enforcement who understood that the mission ahead would be final. The posse began following leads on Bonnie and Clyde's movements. They knew a critical connection was through fellow gang member Henry Methvin. Methvin had drifted from the core group, but his ties remained, especially in Louisiana where his family lived. Hamer suspected the couple would visit Methvin's family, and that gave him a pattern to use. Instead of rushing in, the officers planned to choose a spot where Bonnie and Clyde would be most vulnerable. On the road, inside their Ford Vate, a car offered them no shelter, and once surrounded, they stood little chance, even with the arsenal they were known to carry. By late May, the team identified Louisiana State Highway 154, near the small community of Silas in Bienville Parish, as the right location. The choice came with care. It was rural, isolated, and close to the Methvin residence. The posse even involved Methvin's father in the plan, arranging for him to park his truck on the roadside where Bonnie and Clyde would likely stop. This tactic was meant to stall the couple long enough to ensure there was no escape. The officers set themselves in concealment among the bushes, waiting as the days stretched on. The wait tested their resolve. They knew Bonnie and Clyde travelled quickly and irregularly, sometimes covering hundreds of miles in a matter of hours. To sit silently by the highway demanded patience and nerves. On May 22nd, they stayed hidden, weapons ready, but no car appeared. The following morning, May 23rd, 1934, they continued the watch. Shortly after 9 a.m., the distinct sound of a Ford Vate engine carried down the quiet road. In view came the car they had been waiting for. Clyde Barrow at the wheel, Bonnie Parker beside him. The moment was tense. Reports describe heartbeats quickening as officers readied their automatic rifles, shotguns, and pistols. They had no doubt about the car's occupants. As the Ford slowed near the truck left on the road, the posse opened fire. The first shot, credited to Officer Prentice Oakley, struck Clyde in the head, killing him instantly. According to Ted Hinton's later account, Bonnie screamed as the shooting began. What followed was a storm of gunfire. The officers fired automatic rifles first, unloading completely before shifting to shotguns and then pistols. In total, around 130 rounds tore into the vehicle. The force of the ambush left no chance for Bonnie and Clyde. The official coroner's report later counted 17 entrance wounds on Clyde's body and 26 on Bonnie's. Each was struck multiple times in the head, chest, and limbs. The officer's strategy had been simple: do not risk another escape, and do not give them even a second to raise a weapon. Hinton later explained they weren't taking any chances, describing how each of them carried multiple firearms and used all of them. The barrage was so loud that several of the men experienced temporary deafness afterward. When the shooting stopped, silence hung heavy. The Ford was riddled with bullets, its glass shattered, its doors perforated. Inside sat two lifeless bodies, slumped and bloodied. For years, the couple had been defined by motion, fast cars, escapes across state lines, sudden gunfights. On that stretch of Louisiana road, their story ended in complete stillness. The officers approached cautiously, weapons still drawn, before opening the doors. They confirmed the deaths, then examined the vehicle. Inside, they found a cache of stolen weapons: automatic rifles, sawed-off shotguns, handguns, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. There were also 15 sets of license plates from different states, evidence of how carefully the gang had tried to conceal their tracks from authorities. The discovery underscored the danger the couple represented. Had the officers attempted an arrest without overwhelming force, they might have faced another bloody defeat. The emotions among the posse varied. Hamer was later quoted saying, "I hate to bust the cap on a woman, especially when she was sitting down. However, if it wouldn't have been her, it would have been us." His statement reflected the unease some officers felt about killing Bonnie, but also the recognition that the couple's crimes left little alternative. After Grapevine and Commerce, the expectation was clear. If Bonnie and Clyde resisted, lawmen would end them on the spot. News of the ambush spread quickly. Before long, locals arrived at the scene, drawn by the sound of gunfire and word spreading through town. The scene turned chaotic. Crowds swarmed the vehicle, some attempting to cut pieces of Bonnie's hair, others reaching for her clothing or fragments from the car. Souvenir hunters saw no boundary, treating the death car as a macabre prize. Officers scrambled to push people back and restore control, but the curiosity and frenzy made the aftermath resemble a carnival more than a crime scene. The Ford, its body punctured by bullet holes, soon entered its own afterlife as a cultural object. It was towed from the site, inspected, and eventually turned into a travelling exhibit. For decades, the car was displayed around the country, appearing at fairs and sideshows, drawing crowds eager to gaze at the bullet-stained vehicle where Bonnie and Clyde's lives ended. Later, it was purchased by a casino near Las Vegas, where it still rests behind glass with Clyde's torn shirt on display. The relic became an extension of their myth, a physical reminder of their violent deaths that also fueled a fascination with their story. The effect of the ambush was immediate. The notorious partnership of Bonnie and Clyde was over. The lawmen of Texas and Louisiana walked away alive, satisfied that the outlaws would never strike again. Yet the nature of their deaths only deepened public intrigue. Newspapers splashed the story across front pages, photographs of the riddled car circulated, and crowds lined funeral routes. Instead of burying the legend, the ferocity of their deaths gave it new life. For years, Bonnie and Clyde had survived ambushes, dodged law enforcement, and built a myth through their actions and images. On that morning in Bienville Parish, the chase ended in overwhelming force. Their reign was silenced at last. But the spectacle of their end only fed the story further, and as the dust settled on Highway 154, America was left to reckon not just with the crimes they committed, but with the cultural echo that would follow their names into the decades ahead. Why do we remember Bonnie and Clyde as lovers, not killers? Their crime spree ended in a storm of bullets on a Louisiana roadside in May of 1934, but the story did not stop there. From the moment their Ford was hauled away, their memory began to shift from fact to myth. Across decades, films, songs, and even traveling carnival shows turned the bloody reality into something closer to legend. When you picture Bonnie and Clyde today, chances are you see two young outlaws in love, not the trail of bodies they left behind. That tension between the romance and the violence is what keeps their names alive nearly 90 years later. The most enduring piece of the story is the death car itself. Their Ford Vate, still riddled with more than 100 bullet holes, toured the country for 3 decades after the ambush. Fairgrounds, amusement parks, and roadside attractions displayed it as a major draw. For $1, visitors could climb inside the very seats where Bonnie and Clyde died. Other items, like Bonnie's torn clothing and weapons from the car, were sold or displayed, turning tragedy into spectacle. The car was more than a relic. It became a physical stage where people could interact with the end of the couple's lives, fueling fascination long after the funerals ended. At the same time, songs and ballads began romanticizing their story. Country singers and folk performers played tunes that celebrated their reckless loyalty to one another. Some ballads highlighted the devotion between them more than the crimes themselves, casting the pair as doomed lovers caught in a fight against the odds. Audiences in the Depression era found something appealing in the thought of two young kids rebelling against a system they believed had denied them a future. This early musical storytelling planted the seeds for how Bonnie and Clyde would later be remembered. The biggest shift in public memory came more than 30 years later, with the release of Arthur Penn's 1967 film Bonnie and Clyde. Starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, the film was both a critical and commercial success. Its stylish cinematography, costumes, and charismatic leads turned the couple into pop culture icons. Viewers saw gorgeous actors speeding across the countryside, lovers bound together until death, with gun battles shot more like drama than horror. The reality that 12 people were killed, including 9 police officers, was not ignored, but the framing of the story emphasized youth, beauty, and rebellion far more than blood. As a result, the film crowned them as the golden standard of outlaw romance. The effect of Penn's film can hardly be overstated. It influenced not only how people looked back at Bonnie and Clyde, but also how movies portrayed outlaws going forward. Instead of one-dimensional criminals in shadows, outlaws became handsome, stylish rebels. For the generation of the late 1960s, a time of great social upheaval, the movie hit the perfect note. Viewers who mistrusted authority saw Bonnie and Clyde not as ruthless killers, but as glamorous figures fighting a system that deserved resistance. And so, their myth was cemented at an even deeper level. But reality was not so kind. Between 1932 and 1934, Bonnie and Clyde's actions left 12 people dead. 9 were law enforcement officers, men who left behind families and young children. John J. N. Bucher, Deputy Eugene Moore, Officer Howard Hall, and others lost their lives during the couple's reckless run. Patrolman H. D. Murphy and Ed Wheeler died on Easter Sunday in Grapevine, while Constable William Cal Campbell was killed in Oklahoma only days later. These victims had families who grieved in silence, while stories of Bonnie and Clyde's romance filled newspapers and stages. Their names quickly faded while the outlaws' names grew. For the victims' families, that erasure was painful. Their struggle never made headlines in the same way. Mourning widows and orphaned children lived with loss, not myth. Their stories highlight why the legend feels so unsettling when held against reality. Behind the ballads and films were funerals, empty chairs, and lives forever altered. Families' calls for justice were overshadowed by stylized images of Bonnie smiling with a pistol, or Clyde leaning against his car. The gap between myth and reality widened until truth itself became almost secondary. Pop culture kept expanding the story. Comedic parodies appeared, like the Looney Tunes cartoon Bunny and Claude, We Rob Carrot Patches, in 1968. Television movies in the 1990s revisited the crimes, while miniseries and documentaries in the 2000s kept their image fresh for new audiences. Each new retelling added layers that often shifted focus away from actual victims. Instead, Bonnie and Clyde became shorthand for a ride-or-die couple. Modern music, including Jay-Z and Beyoncé's song, 3 Bonnie and Clyde, used them as symbols of loyalty and love, not as cautionary tales of crime. To describe any pair of criminals working together, people now use the phrase, modern-day Bonnie and Clyde, showing how deeply the image has embedded itself in language. The fascination also has a darker side. Commentators often use the phrase Bonnie and Clyde syndrome to describe hybristophilia, the attraction toward those who commit violent crimes. Their fame serves as an early example. While families buried their dead, others wrote letters celebrating them or collected souvenirs from the crime scene. This same paradox has appeared later with figures like Ted Bundy or Charles Manson, showing that the public's interest in crime is not limited to justice or safety. It can also be rooted in fascination with danger. Yet their legacy is not only cultural. Their spree also influenced law enforcement itself. Clyde's habit of crossing state lines in stolen cars brought the FBI into their pursuit, strengthening federal involvement in bank robbery and interstate crime. Before Bonnie and Clyde, cooperation between local departments was minimal. Afterward, greater coordination among states and stronger regulations around firearms and robberies began to take root. In that way, their bloody run forced the government to adapt to criminals who moved faster and wider than traditional policing had expected. Even in their deaths, their story was surrounded by exploitation. Souvenirs taken from the Ford included weapons, pieces of clothing, and small personal items. Families asked for belongings back, but were often refused. Sheriff Henderson Jordan was accused by the Barrow family of keeping a suitcase of cash, with writer Jeff Gwynne noting that Jordan bought land soon after the ambush. While evidence for that claim remains uncertain, the suggestion alone shows how muddied the aftermath became. Their end was not just tragic but turned into business, both for lawmen who participated in the ambush and for the travelling exhibits that followed. So why do we remember their story the way we do? Perhaps because their imagery was so powerful. Bonnie with her handwritten poems, Clyde in his sharp suits, both posed beside cars that looked modern and sleek to Depression-era eyes. That image, spread through newspapers, reinforced later by Hollywood, became a kind of cultural armor, shielding them from being seen only as killers. The deaths of 12 victims and the grief of families are historical facts, but the public imagination prefers Bonnie and Clyde as doomed lovers cut down too soon. Has history forgiven them, or has it simply chosen to forget the victims? The answer lies in that gap between myth and reality. The myth of loyal lovers, glamorous, young, and doomed, has proven stronger than the truth of bloody shootouts and grieving families. And so, Bonnie and Clyde live on in legend, their story no longer confined to newspaper headlines or police reports, but carried forward in songs, films, language, and culture. For better or worse, the myth became bigger than the lives themselves, leaving us to ask where memory ends and legend begins.